receipt of benefits from the state to reciprocate by accepting the appropriate burdens, by accepting the duties of citizenship. In modern times, it was first sketched by H.L.A. Hart. When a number of persons conduct any joint enterprise according to the rules and thus restrict their liberty, those who have submitted to these restrictions when required have the right to a similar submission from those who have benefited from their submission. The argument was further developed by Rawls in his 1964 paper Legal Obligation and the Duty of Fair Play. It was modeled by Nozick in Anarchy, State and Utopia. It was reported, expanded, defended, and ultimately dismissed by Simmons in Moral Principles and Political Obligations that it has been revivified, developed, and endorsed by Klosko in the Principle of Fairness and Political Obligation. Hart is clear that his of the grounding of political obligation should be sharply distinguished from those that derive obligation from consent or promises. If the argument works, it has the same power as the argument from the hypothetical consent, of which it may be presented as an elaboration. To attribute obligations to those who expressly disavow consent. That said, there is a very real difficulty in distinguishing cases where the argument applies from obvious cases of tacit consent. To see this, consider Robert Nozick's well-known objection. Suppose some of the people in your neighborhood are 364 other adults have found in a public address system and decide to institute a system of public entertainment. They post a list of names, one for each day, yours among them. On his assigned day, one can easily switch days. A person is to run the public address system, play records over it, give news bulletins, tell assuming stories he has heard, and so on. After 138 days, on which each person has done his part, your day arrives. You are obligated to take your turn. You have benefited from it, occasionally opening the window to listen, enjoying some music, or chuckling at someone's funny story. The other people have put themselves out, but must you answer the call when it is your turn to do so? As it stands, surely not. Though you benefit from the arrangement, you may know all along the 364 days of entertainment supplied by others will not be worth giving up one day. You would have rather not have any of it and not give up a day, and you have it all, spend one of your days at it. It is hard to reject Nozick's conclusion in respect of this particular example, not least since we are naturally wary of others foisting gifts on us and then expecting us to reciprocate in some fashion. How would the story need to amplify in order for us to agree that an obligation has been created? The most obvious ways would to be describe the reluctant player agreeing to set up such a scheme or voting for its institution in a neighborhood poll, or else failing to dissent when an invitation to do so had been extended. But then the argument would at least some sort of consent. Perhaps one could fill out the story so that the dissenter gets great pleasure from the listening, looks forward to transmissions, and then seeks to avoid doing her stint in the Wayfair dodgers, get on buses and avoid payment. Now she looks tight-fisted with her time in the way folk who leave a pub without paying their round are tight-fisted with their wallet. We can elaborate the story to show that she is a poor neighbor, ungenerous and miserly, but unlike the non-player in the pub. I don't think we can accuse her of being unfair to the point of following an obligation, unless we can articulate some convention that she understands and violates. Of course, those who defend the principle of fairness will insist that the principle itself is the operation convention. But this can't be right. Nozick's counterexample illustrates the need for much specificity. My instinct is the more specificity is provided to make intelligible and particular case, the more evident it will be that we are charting understandings which are familiar to those engaged in the cooperative ventures, and the more explicit such understandings become, the more clearly we shall find that we are witnessing good old-fashioned tacit consent. That is a hunch which you need to verify in the discussion of particular cases. But we can save ourselves the work by examining directly the use of this argument to establish that citizens have duties. An interesting wrinkle on Hart's argument is that if citizens have such duties, he is thinking primarily of the obligation to obey the law, and then these duties are owed not to sovereign but to other citizens. So we can consider how well Hart's principle applies. I think it is a ought to consider the conduct of life in a state as a joint enterprise that citizens undertake, rather like Nozik's hap- helpless listener or human shipbound traveler. We just find ourselves here and probably stuck here too. Nonetheless, we may find that living here has its benefits. The state is a great provider of services. It recruits armies to protect us from the alien aggression, police forces, and other instruments of law, in order to protect us from the criminals. Health services to keep us alive, and well education services to enable us to make a living. The state may be what it claims, the servant of the people. Some of these services we find provided willy-nilly. Some of these we may endorse in a half-hearted fashion. This is how the police force view of them. But some of them we may actively pursue. We may queue for the social service benefits or rush into hospitals for treatment. We may require the state to build more motorways or make better provision to collect our rubbish. Some of these services we may detest, believing that they compromise both our safety and our principles. Many feel this way about the nuclear umbrella. God help us if it rains. Suppose we do seek out what the state has an offer. We do identify specific benefits and demand them. We do request protection or assistance from the state. Are we being unfair to fellow citizens if we do not accept the concomitant burdens of citizenship? I think we might be. Certainly, it is possible to describe examples which present the appearance of unfairness in the sense of folks who benefit mightily being unwilling to accept a reasonable burden. In the 1917 Britain, there was a well publicized case of a very wealthy family, polo press, and friends of royalty, owners of great, who had paid no taxation on the profits of their businesses for most of the century. My mother in law, on reading this story, turned from a conservative to a Trotsky overnight. Such people aren't paying their way. Who knows what songs the sirens of self deception sing to them as they sign the income tax forms their clever accountants prepare, government approve, and encourage the sentiments of disapproval. But sadly, most often when the villains are no great gainers, being welfare scroungers or the like, it is the cases, the likes, which lend most plausibility to heart's insight, which is where the principle of fairness is employed to the identify cheats. Those who aren't playing by the rules of the game, though if they are rich enough, they will be abiding by the rule of law. Hart's principle is very abstract. Too abstract, I suggest for universal application without examining the details of the circumstances which is employed. Where it is articulated in circumstances wherein it finds plausible employment, it amounts to the claim that it is unfair. If, for example, people aren't paying for goods they enjoy, if the enjoyment is secured by the payments of others or whose willingness or mute acceptance or inability to escape payment, they freeload or free ride as a justification of one's legal obligation not to steal, for example. The argument is one's legal obligation to steal. For example, the argument is unnecessary theft, as many other crimes violates moral rights, which is the state affirms and reinforces. The thief is first and the foremost a thief. We don't need to find him guilty of free riding in our anxiety to specify the moral wrong as a justification of legal punishment. Nozick's cheeky counterexample serves as a useful purpose in forcing us to examine the circumstances in which benefits are extended and enjoyed. It requires us to examine what we ask of the state and how it is to be paid for. Hart's argument is at bottom sound. We shouldn't both insist on provision of the benefits and then make every effort to avoid paying for them when this inevitably puts the burden of payment on others. The principle of fairness requires that we shouldn't cheat, that we shouldn't dump the cost of services we embrace on others. I think we all understand this. I think no one believes that the services of government are costless. Manna from a bureaucratic heaven, in which case we need to explore the understandings to find the conventions or consent within our acceptance or pursuit of good government provides. If we are honest, or we should recognize the burdens our acceptance entail. But if we are clear sighted, we shall deny that these burdens come in a package that cannot be dismembered, as though if we buy one, we buy all. This is what governments are prone to tell us. We don't need to believe them. They say if we want the protection of the local constabulary, we have to pay for the nuclear weapons. And we know that they have ways of making you pay. What they cannot do, wherever benefits are touted but rejected, it insists that fairness grounds the demand for payment. Haas' principle of fairness is silly. If it purports to justify those restraints on my liberty which should prevent me harming others, as though it would be quite wrong for me to assault them or steal from them only in so far as they require the state to protect me against the predations of others. Such behavior would be wrong, even if one made no such claims and announced that one regarded himself as in the Hobbesian state of nature with everyone else. Think again of militiamen. There is a source of independence he is likely to assert. It would be futile exercise to try to track down the state services he accepts. We are likely to find ourselves trying to pin him down to accepting the Department of Defense and the nuclear umbrella. He is likely to take us seriously and buy more ammunition. Those who think this argument has a strength as I do should draw in their horns. If folks solicit benefits, they should recognize that these have a cost and I should accept that the cost is civility, a willingness to otherwise pay their way. I say this is a good argument. This doesn't mean that it applies to everyone or that anyone to whom it does apply should accept all the burdens that state is eager to impose. It's just a caution, don't seek out the goodies that the state dangles before you. Without exploring the small print, in a sense, this advice is a choice. There is no small print governing our transaction with the state. Unless the understandings are written up explicitly and published in a print large enough for even or to be literal, especially the blind to read, we are not committed to them and should not find ourselves presumed to accept them. The state should be welcome Hart's arguments. It captures a wider segment of the population than he- heretofore could be enlisted as dutiful citizens, but obviously there will be some who announce that they will take all that is offered so long as this does not entail any obligation on their own part. They are oblivious to quick considerations of fairness since they pronounce themselves willing to do without the touted benefits, perhaps being militiamen as they are well armed. Gratitude and good government. I can think of one last argument that state may advance, and perhaps the last should have been first. Since this argument was outlined by Socrates in the Plato's Crito, this argument claims that the citizens ought to be grateful for what they have received from the state, and further, the gratitude should be signaled by the citizens' acceptance of their duties. Again, the first step in the argument is the claim that the citizens have received benefits, so to proceed, we must assume that this is true. Clearly, if the citizens do not receive benefits from the state, there is nothing for them to be grateful for. The next step in the argument is the claim that citizens ought to feel grateful to the state. The final step is the claim that acceptance of duties of citizenship is the appropriate expression of gratitude. We can see the distinctness of steps 2 and 3 in details of a recent immigration case reported in the newspaper, which recaptures this structure nicely. An army officer's life was saved by one of his Gurkha soldiers. Properly, he felt grateful and expressed his gratitude by promising to educate the soldier's son in Britain. As these things go, the son was refused the necessary immigration credentials. So, as the former officer, a wealthy man, said he would leave the country too. I think, but I am not sure that the story had a happy ending. In the first place, the officer was right to feel grateful. In the second place, he chose to express his gratitude by taking on an obligation to the father and to the boy to see to his education. Having taken on board this obligation, the officer judged correctly that he was morally required to fulfill it. One can think of other ways in which the officer could have expressed his gratitude, ways which did not place him under obligation. Indeed, this is a nice example of how acts of gratitude can be generous as the services that give rise to them. It is important that the steps 2 and 3 in the argument are distinguished. They can easily become conflated when we speak of debts of gratitude as though the government pursues payment of these debts when it holds us to our obligations. Rosario stated that gratitude is a duty to be paid, but not a right to be accepted. Not accepted, this is by parents against children, or by the state against its citizens. Since many of the duties of the citizens are enforceable, Rosario thought they could be derived from the gratitude. As we shall see, this is a mistake. For the moment, though, we should register the philosophical oddity of speaking of depths of gratitude, of announcing feelings of gratitude in the language of I owe you one. The payment of debts can be insisted on as an obligation of the debtor, whereas, however appropriate or felicitous gratitude might be, it can't be the proper object of a demand or claim the issue of a special right. It is perfectly clear, on the other hand, that we can insist that persons ought to be grateful, taking gratitude to be a distinctive feeling or attitude appropriate in one who has received the benefit. We teach our children that gifts cannot be claimed as rights and they ought to feel appropriately grateful. We train them to feel grateful by making them act out the rituals of gratitude, minimally saying thank you and undertaking the chore of the writing conventional thank you letters following birthdays and Christmas. We trust that in these ways we can teach them what to feel as well as how to behave. We teach good habits as a way of inculcating good disposition of the character. These commonplaces are worth of bringing to mind because they effectively refute on one line of argument against the claim that political obligations may derive from gratitude. The bad argument goes as follows. If political obligation is an obligation of gratitude, and if an obligation of gratitude is an obligation of feel certain things, there can be no political obligations, on these grounds at least. Since we cannot make sense of obligations or duties to feel certain things in a certain way, feelings cannot be object of obligations. In any case, political obligation are obligations to act, not to feel, to act obediently, for example, rather than to feel obedient. This argument runs together the different steps in argument that I have been at pains to distinguish. But at the heart of it is a claim that should be disputed to the effect that we cannot be required to have a specific feelings since feelings aren't a sort of things we can be expected to control by way of trying to have or inhibit. This is a blunder of a crudely kinetic sort. Feelings can be taught or learned, modified, sharpened, or quieted by the effort on the part of the sufferer and her educators. And this includes feelings of gratitude. Indeed, feelings were not in some measure in the control of those who exhibit them. It would be odd to criticize folk for the lack of them. In the case of ingratitude, this is particularly obvious. I can expect that it is odd to speak of obligations to feel gratitude, but that is not that I am trying to establish. Rather, I seek to show that one can claim that people ought to feel gratitude without committing a philosophical blunder. The next claim that needs to be defended is that it is philosophically acceptable to say of citizens that they ought to feel grateful for the goods and services they receive from the government. I don't want to claim that any such judgment is true. Who knows which government is being discussed? Just that the preposition makes sense. This claim needs defense because there are objections in the field. The first objection begins with the plausible thought of feelings of gratitude are only appropriate as a response to benefits which have been conferred with a suitable motive. If you give me a fast motorbike in the hope that I will soon come a cropper, I will feel no gratitude as soon as I learn of your device plan. To generalize, the identification of goodwill in the provision of the benefit is required before gratitude is appropriate. In the case of gratitude for the services of the state, we must thereable be able to impute motives of the state to the state, but the attribution of motives to a government may be impossible or incoherent. The only possible reply is that we do it all the time. The only possible reply is that we do it all the time. And we are equally cavalier in our imputation of motives to other institutions. This firm cares or doesn't care for its staff. This university takes seriously or ignores its task of teaching students. This hospital is helpful to or hates patient visitors. We One could reply that this talk is metaphorical, but this would not be a statement of obvious. Rather, I suspect it would indicate a strong and controversial philosophical position, most likely some variety of methodological individualism. We can shelve these discussions and move on. Supposing that when, for example, it is claimed that this government really cares for old age pensioners, the claim may be true or false but is not incoherent. Let us accept that motives can be fairly attributed to the state. A further difficulty is encountered in attributing minimally motives of goodwill to the state. We are thinking of the state as Lady Bountiful, or more likely Big Brother, viewing its disposing of goods and services in the manner of gifts. On the contrary, the state is a servant. It has nothing but duties to fulfill, and we should not be grateful when it complies with the duties to its citizens. We should not be grateful to the policeman who rescues us from the football fans who are just about to beat us up. He is doing his job. This too is an error, but it is understandable. We should resent the posture of the statesman who speaks as though he is spending his own money. Nonetheless, the ancient analogy with the family can be usefully employed here. Parents have duties to their children willy nilly, as children nowadays are prone to remind them, I didn't ask to be born. You might have heard. This doesn't not disqualify the thought that children should be grateful for what they have received of right. The duties of the parent can be fulfilled with love and grace, but even a grudging concession to a legitimate demand can merit gratitude. After all, as we know too well, some parents can't manage even this. Isn't the same true of governments? Don't we recognize the difference between an ethos of genuine service or and a time serving reluctance to respect limits? And shouldn't we be grateful even to heartless bureaucrats who are efficient and conscientious in the delivery of goods they are appointed to distribute? I can imagine. Indeed, have heard argument pro and cons, but I do not believe that the logical space for such disputes is the product of fallacious reasoning. I don't see, in principle, why one who does their duty should not merit our gratitude. The final objection to the idea that one may be grateful to the state for the goods and services it provides draw attention to the constitution of the state. It asks in the first place to whom or to what should one be grateful, some abhorring the possibility that an exotic metaphysic may be imputed to them, insists that the citizen who has grounds for gratitude should be grateful to her fellow citizens. This strikes me as an invasion. One should not be grateful to all one's fellow citizens severally. Some, as we have seen, have resolutely avoided paying their share towards the provision of services of which they have been massive beneficiaries. Others, perforce, have been recipients only, being too poor to make any payment towards social provision. Shame on the first, damn shame for the second. But in either case, feelings of gratitude would be misplaced. So, if we should be grateful to our fellow citizens, we have to think of them collectively, which, on my reading, amounts to being grateful to the state. There is something creepy about sentiments of gratitude being directed toward the modern state, but part of this may be due to reluctance to see the state as other. Aren't we all Democrats nowadays? We shall have more to say about democracy in the final chapter, but for the moment, we should recognize that one element in democratic thinking is the claim that we all have equal political standing, regarding the state as other and in some measure alien to us, seems to presuppose a hierarchical relationship between the state and the citizen, which does not sit well with the democratic ideals. The instinct which grounds the suspicion that there is something undemocratic about institutions to which one may direct gratitude expresses a truth which is hard to weigh. The only form of state in which gratitude seems to be inappropriate would be a direct democracy, which takes all decisions by plebiscite, a simple Russian model wherein all the equal citizens and subjects. In this model, citizens should have be viewed as providing goods and services for themselves, like members of a winning football team. They should feel pride rather than gratitude for the success in self-provision. But even in these circumstances, gratitude might not be entirely out of place. Citizens may think of the democracy as a unity, which serves all its members. Players in winning team may feel grateful to the team and their fellow members for granting them the opportunity of success, as well as pride for the part they have played in achieving it. In any event, the modern representative forms of democracy do not work like this. The structures of decision making and bureaucracies created to put policies into effect are sufficiently alien to citizens. Their gratitude may be appropriate when they perform their assigned functions concisely and well. I conclude that one who feels grateful for the provision of state services has not committed a philosophical error, though in particular circumstances gratitude may be misplaced, may indeed be witness to the citizen's rapture by a successful ideology. If this is right, we can now move on to the final question. What does gratitude require of the citizens who properly feels it? Here, there are two routes we can take. The first is indirect, arguing that one who fails to comply with the duty of citizenship harms the state. The focus is not so much on the requirement of gratitude, but on the evil of ingratitude. As Hobbes saw, ingratitude is often imprudent. The fourth law of nature requires that a man which received benefit from another of mere grace endure that he which giveth is he will give it have no reasonable cause to repent him of his goodwill. But as many have taught us, as well as being imprudent is also a great vice to a harm benefactor. Is this what we are doing when we fail in our political obligations? We certainly may be. The state is harmed indirectly if we evade payment of taxes, commit treason, or encourage others to break the law. But not all law breaking is like this. It is surely a matter of fact whether the state is harmed when the citizens break the licensing laws or drive beyond the speed limits, and often such acts will be harmless. I don't see any argument that could take us to the conclusion that all lawbreaking amounts to ingratitude since it harms the state or one's fellow citizens. The direct way of arguing will serve us just as well. All that gratitude to the state could require is that citizens do their duty by it. It is entirely disingenuous to suggest that we might willingly take the benefits the state provides, send a thank you letter, then does the demand of the state, refusing to take compliance as an obligation. But on the other side, as I stated before, we should not be too professed about these duties, identifying them as an all or nothing requirement that citizens obey all the laws all the time. The good society and the sensible state can afford to be relaxed about the incidence and severity of lawbreaking. Individuals should not be worried about their standing as good citizens is impugned by an episode of after hours drinking or opportunistic speeding on an empty motorway. The duties of citizenship under good government should not generally weigh in as an onerous burden or tight constriction. Though on occasions, for example, a call for military service, the demand may be severe. Finally, it may be suggested that it is odd to think of compliance as a grateful response, since the state exacts compliance most of that citizens' duties being enforceable demanded under threat of penalty, but demanding isn't getting. However forceful the demands of the state, the liberal insists that they have no legitimacy until they are endorsed by the citizen. It is in the process of inspecting the demands of the state that a citizen should take account of the fact that it is a fact that he has benefited in a fashion for which he should be grateful. Before we leave this question, there is one qualification that ought to be made. Gratitude is the appropriate response to good government, not barely government that provides us with the goods and services we value. Suppose a state has two classes of citizens, those who receive benefits and those who are excluded from benefits. Should those in the lucky class feel grateful and endorse the political obligations which are thereby incumbent on them? My inclination is to conclude that they should not. To use the analogy of the family, which gives me particular pleasure, gives the decision or direction it has made, which from modern contributors to this debate who dismiss swiftly the lessons Plato derives from it. Should that ugly sisters feel grateful to their parents for the benefits they have been granted and thereby accept an obligation to follow their parents' wishes or obey their commands? If they know that their good fortune has been achieved at Cinderella's expense, nothing has been spent on poor sinners, and the only reason the ugly sisters have time to paint their faces and primp their hair is because Sindhas is busy doing the chores. Probably the ugly sisters feel grateful, but what they do? Too grateful. For for all the duties of parents have their foundations in love and other sloppy sentiments. They can be partly specified as duties incumbent on them in virtue of a role or a position of moral responsibility in which they stand to all of their children equally. Something has gone wrong in a family where there is a grossly inequitable division of labors and favors, whereas parents can't be commanded to love all their children equally or in the same fashion. All the children should recognize that something has gone drastically wrong if it is always one of them who has to sweep the hearth. The ugly sisters should be ashamed of themselves, and these shames should qualify their gratitude. They should feel unworthy of their favoritism they enjoy. I shall take it that this example find a consensus of approval, having found that in pantomimes we all boo in the same places. I claim something similar should be working with respect to our attitudes through the state. If some, in a democracy, it will generally be a majority, receive benefits which others do not enjoy, or receive benefits in a conspicuously or comparatively generous measure. They should regard the benefits as a poised chalice morally tainted by the inequity of its distribution. They should regard themselves as morally compromised, shamed in a fashion the ugly sisters ought to recognize this is an intuition. I can't think of any arguments that might support it beyond the thought that gratitude is not appropriate for the benefits with an unjust or immoral provenance. Now, conclusion. We have examined a variety of arguments that purport to give grounds for citizens accepting the duties of the citizen. Considering these widely, with the exception of the hypothetical contract argument, which needs much careful expansion and defense, all these arguments are conditional on the citizen doing something, severing alliance, being party to a constitutional settlement, behaving in such a way that one may fairly conclude that he accepts a convention which entails obligations, including precipitously conventions which grounds the practice of voting in democracies, or conventions or moral values associated with the acceptance of benefits concerning fairness or gratitude. These are all useful arguments, so as they are not advanced in the expectations that they must be accepted by everyone. So long as they are not taken to be universal in scope, this leads to be a weakness from the point of view of the state that advances them. It seeks to capture all citizens in its net, but if citizens don't do the things from which their obligations may be deducted to follow, they can't be captured. It looks as though it is possible that there will always be citizens who can properly repudiate the duties imputed to them by the state. The conclusion we may be tempted to draw is the dubbed philosophical anarchism, which openly accepts the limitations of the argument cited. The philosophical anarchists, as against the real variety, are content to cite the philosophical deficits in the arguments of the ambitious state. They are gentlemanly lot, not too bothered by the thought which the real anarchist will detest. The prudence for the most part dictates compliance with the state's demand. They will be disposed not so much to protest or wave the black flag in insurrection, but to say, "Excuse me, your arguments aren't quite as good as you believe them to be. This conclusion may well be false." A hypothetical contract has some prospect of success, and some utilitarians believe that they can establish the rules which govern the duties of the citizens. A wise state will see the philosophical anarchist and even military men as a challenge. It will seek to reduce them rather than trample them underfoot by providing benefits they cannot resist and making clear how far the receipt involves conventions or moral principles which require the acceptance of the obligations and consequence. As the arguments in favor of political obligation has been reviewed, I have characterized the stance of the state as adverse as seeking to capture the alliance of the citizens as being able to announce, "Aha, that's your dealt with." To the citizen who would naturally be a reluctant recruit, it's easy to amplify Hume's example of shipbound traveler and identify the state as the press gang. This would be a mistake. We do better to think of state as seducer and the clever citizen as raising the stakes, requesting more and more blandishments, insisting that the goods be delivered. The conservative will hate this talk, recognizing the introduction of a customer or client mentality into the sacred domain of alliance. But then the conservative is always out of date, defending the intuitions of the last but one epoch against advances which are already securely in place. The state, which is eager to claim that its citizens have obligations to do it, does best if it works out how to serve them well. It may well find that there is no philosophical deficit, that militia man is fleeing his own good more fool him. It is vital that we can see clearly the moral stance taken by the state towards its citizens. So the details of the constitution matter when we investigate the obligations of the citizen. We have seen how a democratic constitution can give rise to its own specific reasons for adducing such obligations in the case of quasi consent described by Singer. The fact that such an argument is available is mighty a reason for endorsing democracy, but there are other reasons too for us to comment this family of methods of decision making as well as objections. It is to the examination of these arguments that we now turn. So, here this ends.